Let's start. As I said, we start when there is more participants than speakers, which is good for the debate. It should be a rather interactive panel. We have 4 speakers, and we will move from different territories, coming first from Quebec, then moving to Denmark and Scandinavia, Ontario, and finishing with Michigan, US. The link and the question the panelists were asked, are the political parties still relevant to trade unions, political action? And that was the first one. The second one, what other new allies have the trade unions successfully connected? Which one should be they reach or to be more successful? The fourth one, what creative new tactic methods have been added to trade union repertoire of contention? And finally, what is the link with the populist party? So to have a kind of interactive debate, I propose that you don't answer all the questions, but one by one. So we have 2-3 minutes for each. I think they are different enough. And we finish with the interesting question about the populist. That's the, let's see, to finish the debate with that. As an introduction, and then finally, Raoul will try to summarize this fantastic debate for the next panel, because we have a next panel. To try to introduce kind of European perspective about that, because that's exactly what is discussed at the ETUI, European Trade Union Confederation. You will have the European election in a few months, 6 months, in May. They know more or less that the result, I will return to that, will be a disaster for them, for the allies, that Social Democrats will lose a lot of members. And there is a discussion what to do. And there will be a growing number of populist extreme right receiving support for the next election. So that's really at the heart of all the debate of the ETUI in the preparation of the Congress. What is the link between the trade unions, and you know the ETUI are gathering all the trade unions in Europe, so it's not only the Social Democrat, there is Christian, and there are even in Europe, in my country, a liberal trade union. So they go to the liberal too. So that's the question they have. And what to do with the allies, and what to do with the allies when the Social Democrat will have a candidate which is from the right wing of the Social Democrat. And that's really a complex conversation, because your allies are presenting a candidate, most probably Timmermans, who is Dutch, and who is has kind of deregulatory approach of the social, and is not at all close to the trade union. So what to do? It's an open question. That's they don't have the answer, but clearly it's partly to speak with other. Just to give you, because generally in Quebec and North America there is kind of time to time so positive view about what is happening in Europe. That's the number of members of ETUI. So that I start, at the start they had 48 million members, and when I will finish in a few years, they will have less than 40 million. So 20% less, and every year the global trade union movement is losing between 400,000 to 500,000 members a year. Not only in Eastern Europe, but also now in the core of the trade union movement, which is Germany. Germany is losing 50,000 members in absolute term every year, but also Belgium. Belgium, we had the situation where trade unions were really stable, and in both countries, the problem is demographic. more people are going out than going in the labor market. So it's really difficult to change that, because in any case, even you have the same rate and you don't have the same rate of affiliation, there have more people leaving than entering because of demography in the labor market. So that's the situation for the trade union. So there is no kind of sense of urgency. What do we need to do? Because Christophe here calculate that if we continue the trends, the last trade unionists will disappear in Europe in 2110. We know it's not true, but that's the trends. Okay, we will be dead at that time, most of us. The other, no, that's the stuff. The other graph, and, okay. That's demographics. Okay, no, that's that's the Social Democrat. Okay, look to the Social Democrat. It's coming from the oral study body, and that's they were very stable until the 80s, and then start to have a little bit less, but it was a few percent less. And no, and that's with the forecast for the election in France, Germany, and the third one, the Netherlands. So they will have less 10%, but the forecast, the results were much worse than the forecast. So it was more than 10%. So that's the kind of social democrat disappear in the Netherlands. They don't exist. In France, they will not exist for a few years. They still have. And in Germany, they are in big trouble. So if you take the kind of social democrats, so you have a kind of two trends. You have the trade unions having a huge decrease, and the social democrat having a huge decrease, and having, take a seat, that's where already double the number of participants.
This is a uniform delegation.
Yeah, that's good.
They'd like to make an
they arrive at the right point when the substance is coming and not the introduction. So the kind of social democrat have completely disappeared in Eastern Europe. So you have the trade union disappearing in Eastern Europe, and you have the social democrat disappearing in Eastern Europe. So both, I think, illustrate a little bit the sense of urgency for the trade unions, but also the link. It's the first question with the social democrat in Europe, and the link between the two, and that's the social democrat. You see, that's the result of the election. I think since the last 10 years, it's no longer, and you see how many now are below 20%. And I think that's the key question. If you have less member, if you cannot have support of the social democrat in government, what do you do? And the answer is very different from different perspectives. So I give you to Lorenzo first the floor to explain a little bit more what's happening in Quebec.
Yeah.
You have to speak in.
Okay, in the microphone. Thank you. It's okay. And smile to the camera. Okay, as much as possible. Okay.
And be brief, because
I'm going to be brief. Look, 46, 49. Okay, can I touch upon any of these points?
Yeah, you can start what you you think the most relevant for your.
Yeah. I will start in 3 minutes. I will start from the conclusion. So I did kind of 40 interviews with union executives in Quebec about how union can draw on the confidence on society. So in my previous research, I found pretty much confidence toward unions, even increasing in Europe. So we see the decrease in membership, the decrease in social democracy, but the increase in confidence toward unions. So I ask unions, what is your strategy toward the society? How can you really take advantage of some people who are not members, but they would like to support unions? So I developed two different scenarios. One was a very positive scenario where I had 4 co-workers. One of them was very pro-union, and the other 3 were not in favor of unions, so he cannot become a member, the guy who is in favor of the unions. And I said, what is your strategy to try to really take advantage of this person who would like to be, who is in favor of the unions? And most of the answer I got was, okay, let's try to find a problem in their plant. Let's try to find problem. Let's try to sell the insurance maybe so we can unionize all the plant. That is not possible because, I mean, 3 people are completely against the unions. The second scenario was about a complete negative scenario where I had a migrant worker who had a terrible employment condition, was passing by, finally he quit the job, and he's passing by on the street and see union, trade union of professor or whatever union. And so he enters and says, sorry, this is my situation. All my labor rights have not been respected during 5 years. I had the terrible conditions of job employment conditions. What can you do for me? And there I got the sound of silence, the answers I got. So all of these, we start to brainstorm about possible strategies to reach out for society. And I got, I mean, a good half an hour of complaints from the union saying, oh, it's globalization, it's this, members are not engaged, and this and that. We don't have that many resources. I say, okay, I give you a blank check. You can write whatever amount of money you want. 50 millions, 50 millions. 500 millions, 500 millions. What you do? Few ideas came up. How to reach out for society, how to reach out for these people that they need unions, but they are not union member, or that would like to support unions. They have a good job conditions, but they cannot be members. So then I still have 1 minute, correct? Then there are some experiences that are very interesting by trial and errors. But there is not a clear vision and strategic vision how to reach out for the society. Some of them are simply, let's try, okay, our way to reach out for the society is try to unionize in a non-for-profit organization. Okay, that's okay, they are closer to the society, they work with migrant workers. That is kind of, let's say, normal way. Another way, many people, they have many union executives, they have a double belonging. Maybe they are union executives or they are very active members, and at the same time they belong to a civil society organization. And that's the way where they can try to collaborate and to cooperate for specific issues. Sometimes the link is reverted, so there are many civil society organizations searching for unions, but just for some kind of financial help or this kind of stuff. What is very interesting is that the unions oftentimes they try to work at arm's length distance. So they do some kind of activities and they open up, say, bring your friend, bring your family. Sometimes then there is an issue of scale. We have some maybe cooperation with some civil society organization or the society at large at a local level, but they're not well known at the peak union organizational level, and they don't give. Okay, I can finish it even early. They don't. I mean, there is this link is not clear, and it's not really, I would say, institutionalized. So union, it's more trial and errors. Sometimes there are some nice, interesting dynamics where union trying to expand toward the society based on the identity-based link that can be based on ethnicity, based on young employees, old employees, based on some kind of specific issues. But what came out as an interesting dynamic is really to try to frame everything in terms of justice and fairness based on different identity or local dynamics. So the idea that unions in a specific location they frame their action toward the society based on a specific justice problem that is very urgent in a specific point. And if it is identity-based, that this is very framed in these terms for young workers, employees, in a wide term, not just members, or ethnical origins or older employees or LGBT, etc., etc. Okay, I finished, so I can.
Okay, thank you. What I propose, that's you answer the first question, the one you think is the most relevant for you because of the situation. So you are not obliged to have the first, here was the third one. And I will raise some question, perhaps, depending, but you answer in the next round, so you have time to think. And for you, my question, because we had that debate in Europe too, but what we notice is many people who join trade unions, but they don't stay. And that's something different to reach new group. It's just they come, and after 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, they are leaving because nobody take care about them. So is there the same debate in Quebec that people are coming but leaving quickly because they don't pay attention to these new members? But you have at least 12 minutes to think. So the next, we move with Steen from FAOS to Denmark. Interesting case, and expand a little bit on Scandinavia or Nordic country, depending on your geography.
Thank you very much for the invitation. We're always the odd man out, I think, right? Because we have this union density of 70% and stuff like that, so it doesn't seem like we have any problems whatsoever. But I think we do, and this very morning when I opened my email, I got a mail from my union, which is the Danish Teachers Higher Education Teachers Union, and it actually said in the top line, should we still be here 10 years from now? So that was a very bold question from a union, all things considered, and it linked to other little articles about what should we do if we should still be there, and should we change our services totally. And I think it's very, very well represents right now what the problem is to many unions, right? Because who are we representing? Are we representing them in the right way and so forth? So that's just the framing of all this. The other framing I would like to make, of course, is that when you ask questions about politics and political parties, again, we have a system in the Nordic countries which are probably a little bit different than many other countries because there are such a close cooperation between political parties and the unions and the employers' organization. We also experience every time there's a new government, we have some young lions from the different kind of parties. If it's a social democratic government, they think everything should be socialism, and then they find out there's a labor market, and they're very strong partners on the labor market who want to have a say. So politics on the labor market in Denmark means quite a lot less than in many other countries. That's also a little bold to say it like that, but the fact is that the majority of the labor market is actually controlled through collective bargaining, and that means the political parties have another role than in many other countries where legislation means a lot. That also means political parties are not obsolete. They're actually very important cooperative partners as well. We also have a situation when it comes to the political parties in the EU, as you know, any directive is directed towards the single person, towards the citizen. Our problem in Denmark about that is we want everything in the collective agreement. The collective agreement coverage is about 65 to 70%. Some sectors only like 30%. So you have a rest group who is not covered. Whatever directive is written into the collective agreement is not covered for this group, this remaining group. We're very lucky we're a small country, so EU doesn't look that much at us as they do at people like UK and Germany and so forth. But we have an inherent problem every time the directive is coming. We're supposed to put it into legislation, but that's not how we regulate in Denmark. We regulate it through collective agreements. So that also means you have to have a pretty close cooperation with political parties as such. To go more in detail about what happens right now with especially the middle right-wing parties and the union movement is that they kind of try to detach themselves from each other right now. They have done that the last 15, 20 years. It's a little bit difficult to find out what they want about it because they didn't have an alternative. They basically just wanted to say we are not only because you are in a union, you don't have to vote social democratic. And I think also one of the things that actually made this movement was some of the more middle right-wing parties coming, the more populist parties that we all have in all countries. They kind of pushed the social democrats to rethink who are actually our constituency. And that also brings up a little bit to question number 4 about the right-wing things, right-wing parties, because the problem about the right-wing parties is that might be the new workers' parties to a very high degree. The right-wing middle parties, they push on certain issues like globalization, like immigration, which is a threat to not you and me, but which is the threat to those workers who are more vulnerable. So they push exactly the buttons. And you can just look at Trump, you can look at Brexit, you can look at Le Pen, and so forth. They push exactly that button. And right now in Denmark, the government, the right-wing government, is totally dependent on the Danish People's Party, which is a middle right-wing. It's right-wing when you talk about immigration. It's right-wing when you talk about globalization. We don't want globalization in this party. That's what they say, basically, right? They don't want immigration either. But all the other politics are very social democratic. So that's really a threat to a social democratic party. And there's no alternative really from the social democrats and from the unions right now, because they push right exactly those buttons that most of the people who are vulnerable, skilled, unskilled workers, threatened by globalization, digitalization, Industry 4.0, that they actually fear. So I'm answering a little bit both questions here, but it's difficult to answer question number 1 without getting into question number 4 as well here.
No problem. I have 2 questions about the Denmark, about the trade union, because you present once again this kind of more or less rosy coverage rate, but if I'm well informed, 10% is by yellow trade unions. They don't do collective bargaining. So as you know, there is in Denmark, there are link between the trade unions and unemployment benefit, and these trade unions say, okay, but I will not do collective bargaining, so I have nobody to pay for doing collective bargaining, but you can have a kind of insurance for the employment. So that's the first one, and the second one is rather interesting, is the kind of, you had a merge between FTF and LO, and they lost 100,000 members, according to the figure they sent to the ETUI, a little bit less. And the third one, the academic, won some members. So it seems also that the story in the trade unions, we think always that Denmark and Scandinavia are a little bit boring because all the same, they are working well. But in Denmark, there is a lot of movement. And perhaps to add to your, and then we move, we have this question of populist parties, not only in Western Europe, it's also in Eastern Europe. And when the peace in Poland discussed with the trade union, OPZZ, the ex-communist, and Solidarność, and the Forum, and they say, okay, we will increase the minimum wage. And the trade unions were rather surprised that the government proposed an increase 10% more than what they called for. So the government was much more generous in increasing the minimum wage than the trade unions. And then they were say, okay, well, what to do with that? And just an example, it's anecdotal, not completely anecdotal. When you have the populists, which are more, let's say, on the left, if you just don't take care about migrant and other, but social stuff, that the trade unions. But we move now to Ontario with the next way with John.
Hi, More good news.
Huh?
More good news.
More good news.
I'm John Peters. I'm from Laurentian University. I'll speak probably more as a long-time construction worker who did it for 20 years and then was an activist on the local labor council for another 10. But I'm also an academic. And as an academic and as an activist and as a worker and a trade union member for probably over 30 years, I'd say, things do look very bleak. I study things like financialization, labor market deregulation, what I call, or has been called, post-democracy. That is the fact that democracy has become more about governments that are by business, for business, and of business than they are about anything to do with people. And I think those are major challenges. And if, in fact, it makes, as those shifts have occurred, that the major shifts in terms of public policy to favor big business and to favor big finance, as governments have moved towards deregulating and flexibilizing employment and creating and eroding collective bargaining legislation, as those things have then played themselves out in terms of long-term union decline and long-term support for social democratic parties, many of them which have also supported these pro-business types of policies, unions themselves have not been able to, and workers and citizens have not been able to challenge that. So that makes politics even more important than ever before. But yet, if you go to talk to union leaders, and you have talked to union members, and you talk to your students, people are more puzzled, people are more frustrated, people are more bewildered, people are more angry, and there's more division amongst unions and amongst activists than ever before. And I think that's a fundamental transformation from what we've seen for much of the past 20th century. Yes, there was division. Yes, there was bewilderment. Yes, there was big capital. But in all those cases, what those unions did, every union, right, had a political strategy, right? Every union didn't agree on what that political strategy was, but every union agreed on a principle. That was equality. That was collective bargaining rights. That was social distribution. That isn't there anymore. The other big problem is a lack of organization. There was a time, right, that unions also involved themselves directly in politics because they saw that their issues, low-wage work, non-unionization, inequality, lack of distribution, were not going to be served by any government unless they did it themselves. Unions are not in that position now. Instead, almost all, sadly, so many of the strategies, and I completely agree with them, are about chasing investment, about taking concessions in bargaining, about trying to expand the competitiveness of one's national economy. And sadly, and then when they look at it, they go, well, our members, some of them are voting conservative. Some of them don't want to hear about issues about social democracy. We can't take controversial stands like that. Well, if unions simply let those kinds and don't take a leadership role and don't take an organizing role to make a better future, the future becomes written for you by the Trumps of the world, by the Salvinis, by the Mays, right? And I think that's the kind of challenge, that there's both, in this sense, a crisis of political imagination, but there's also a major crisis in the labor movement of political organizing and political organization about what those goals are. And to me, those are the big challenges. There's not only the challenges of globalization and neoliberalism, there's the challenges of the labor movement and the lack of a future for working people. And by severing those kinds of things, those are the problems that we have to kind of address. And it's taking place, yes, it's not perfect across. There's no strict kind of convergence in the same way that everything is happening in the United States. But instead, what really, in some ways, is most depressing is that it takes place in all these different kinds of varieties, right? In Denmark, there's the erosion not only of collective bargaining coverage, but of yellow unions, right? And then this mass expansion across of European multi-employers. In Canada, there was a partnership agreement in Newfoundland after an offshore oil boom provided this great benefit. Well, suddenly as oil turned off and the prices went, partnership was down the drain like that. And unions were left saying, well, what do we do now? By not having, right, a vision and not having the will to create and move forward to say, these are the principles we need, right? We need decent work for everyone, right? We need a sharing economy that everyone benefits from. And sadly, what we haven't been talking enough about is that we need an environmentally sustainable economy. And that might mean both zero warming and zero waste. These are the things that we should be trying to fight for. And if we say those are the principles, we may not agree how to get there, but those are the principles that we set, and we make sure our organizations move towards that. Our politics moves towards that, and our education moves towards that in terms of trying to mobilize. And you look, I just watched a video of Ocasio-Cortez, a Democratic nominee in New York this morning, and it moved me to tears. But here is a person, 28 years of age. This shows my age, right? And she said, we are here for working people. And everyone voted for her. And she said, these are the principles we're standing for. And you think, Jesus, this is the United States. How can someone who says they're a socialist suddenly win in the biggest city in the world? Well, guess what? You can. If you stand for principles, if you stand for organization, and you say that this is something that it's a tribute to a victory to all of us in the room. So those are the sorts of things that I think in terms of politics, yes, they have to be important. We face big challenges. How do we reach those challenges? Let's talk about it and let's begin discussing it.
Okay, thank you. More pessimistic will be difficult, but the next one could perhaps succeed with Trump. But before doing that, I think you said something en passant And I would like to hear a little bit more, and certainly if I think there is the car industry is in Ontario too. But you are saying that the big challenge of the future is climate change and zero emission. If you take that seriously, means for the trade union, we think a lot of it is basic. So how can we have in the same time the return of basic principle and value, and at the same time say the challenge for the future could be about no more but better, or even perhaps less and better, which is not really in the genes of the trade union movement for since the beginning. So is there some discussion, or you think there is some path, I don't think avenue, path perhaps is better than avenue, to discuss that, or we say at the end, as we do in Europe, that's not we qualify the growth in green growth, so that we solve the problem to say it will be a smart and green growth, avoiding to discuss about the fundamental. So now we move to US. I don't know if you have a big picture or just for the Michigan, but or the part of US. So Jan.
Thanks. I should just say that in addition to being at the University of Michigan as a faculty member there studying social science, labor matters, I'm also, in the last 2 years, I've been elected president of the non-tenure track faculty union at my university, University of Michigan, 3 campuses, Ann Arbor, Flint, and Dearborn. And in the last 4 years, I've also been the president of the AFL-CIO at the county level. So at the Washtenaw County, where U of M is located, and 3 other counties. So I come at it partly from an academic perspective, kind of started the other direction. I started as an academic, unlike John, and then I've wound up being more of a labor activist. I don't know whether you consider yourself still be. So I come at it from a number of different perspectives, and they don't all entirely, I think we're in a moment of fundamental transition. I think we have in the United States reached, in some ways, politically anyway, if not economically, the end of the neoliberal moment. We're now in a populist moment, but the question is what kind of populism is going to prevail? Trump is obviously in the driver's seat right now and has exerted enormous control over the Republican Party, to many people's surprise how much they have folded to his agenda. But within the Democratic Party, there's also a struggle. It began in 2016 with Bernie Sanders' challenge to the anointed candidate, Hillary Clinton, and it's continued. The candidate from the Bronx that you mentioned is part of that, is part of the further development of that struggle, right? And the Bernie forces are gaining within the Democratic Party. They haven't won that battle, and they may never entirely win it. There's huge entrenched money interest within the Democratic Party, particularly from finance, but nonetheless, they've made real significant progress. And so it feels to me like, but they don't control it. So you have a populist, Trump-led populist Republican Party now pushing very strongly on the anti-immigrant button. I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't the ones that sent cameras down to follow this group that's migrating through Mexico, because this migration has been happening for many years, but now, a few weeks before the election, suddenly there's enormous coverage, and Trump's putting it in every speech. And so I think they're taking advantage, at the very least, of this fact to try to pump up that anti-immigrant sentiment, because it looks like they're going to suffer some major losses in this election unless they're able to mobilize their base. These midterm elections tend to be about turnout, and turnout among the Democratic supporters of the Democratic Party right now had been more fired up, more by everything that Trump does. He's a provocateur. Every day there's some new outrage emanating from his administration. And so, but now he's smart enough to understand that if he can get people very scared and worked up about immigration again, as he managed to do in 2016, this can help perhaps to even up the balance and get back to the normal situation, which is that Republicans are more likely to vote in midterms than Democrats. Anyway, so that's at the national party level. Meanwhile, in Michigan, where I'm based and where I have a fairly, one advantage of being in the labor movement, not just observing and analyzing it, is it's a very opaque thing. It's very hard to understand what's going on in the labor movement, even when you're inside, let alone when you're outside looking at it without any organic ties, within it. And, I would say that the labor movement is probably not so different from what you're discussing. It's not really coordinated. It does not have a clear, unified message. We're not cooperating as much as we should be. A lot of the initiative, interestingly, that's being taken that I think will contribute to turnout and to politics that will actually help working people in our state of Michigan is not coming from the initiative of the labor movement. It's coming from citizens groups that are pushing ballot initiatives, a hangover, if you like, a residue of the old populist era and the progressive era in the United States. In Michigan, unlike I don't think any Canadian provinces have this capacity, citizens can put ballot initiatives, can put things on the ballot. And so 4 things were put on the ballot in this electoral round that are very supportive of working families and likely to increase turnout from people who support that agenda also. 2, interestingly, increase in the minimum wage and earned sick pay, mandatory earned sick pay for all employers above a minimum size, were taken off the ballot. They got plenty of signatures to go on it. The Republican Party pulled a maneuver in the state legislature to pull it off the ballot by passing it. So essentially you have a Republican Party led by kind of DeVos, which is this sort of millionaire, billionaire family that dominates Republican politics in Michigan, kind of the Koch brothers of Michigan. They pulled it off the ballot by voting for the increase and by including the tip minimum wage, by voting for the earned sick pay, with the intention of, in lame duck, after the election is over, gutting the legislation. So basically, sort of a bait and switch. Sort of, we've passed it, it's off the ballot, now then we'll kill it after the election. But it's pretty transparent, and we've been pushing it with members and with people in general, but 2 things remain. One of them is a anti-gerrymandering initiative that's very popular, that was achieved without any financing of signature collection. They got 50% more signatures than they needed in an entirely volunteer-led effort that was organized and led by people who had no prior political experience of any kind. They weren't party people, they weren't labor people, they weren't from any of the existing NGOs or social movement organizations. They just arose in the wake of the 2016 election. And that kind of thing has been happening in the United States, not just in Michigan, but elsewhere, and shows a kind of citizenry, at least a certain element of it, that is very much engaged by what has happened, is very much resisting the kind of direction in which Trump's right-wing populism wants to take the country. So, I think in Michigan we'll probably get good turnout because of that. I should also mention there's a marijuana legalization ballot initiative. We can perhaps look to Canada for, advice on how to handle that, because it's going to pass overwhelmingly. So we'll be joining you in the ranks of legalized marijuana very soon. At any rate, I don't want to go on. There's much more to be said, but I think, we're in a moment when it's hard to know how it's all going to sort out. It's really a question of organizing. Can the right populists out-organize the left populists? And I think the jury is very much still out on that, but I do worry that the labor movement in my state is not in that game very much. We're not organizing the left populist response in the way that we should be contributing to. And I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about that.
Okay, thank you. I have one remark and one question. I think both of you said at the end, the trade union movement, either we are in, is very difficult to understand. And I can confirm from my side that it's a complex beast. But how can we have a complex beast communicating correctly? I think that's something perhaps you can address all. Another one, you didn't touch this question, but I'm wondering if there is any debate in US. So the strategy, the AFL-CIO and others was to support the Democrat each time, and then even when they control the Congress, they don't pass the law they hope they will pass. So is there no kind of learning process or some kind of because you support, they support, not you, you because you are a member, the Democrat and have nothing in return or very little. And is there some reflection for the next election about that? So we turn for the second round. We will not have 4 rounds, so you can have the 2 next questions. I have a strict instruction by Raoul. That's I just verify that we should finish the first round in 23 minutes, and that's very strict. And then we open the debate with the room, so that you had my question, you can answer or not, and the other that you would like to continue to discuss.
Thank you. So about your question about if members they leave and they stay and membership volatility, not that much as in Europe, theoretically. I mean, in Europe, it's an individual choice. People can enter and can leave whenever they want, more or less. Here, it's more a collective choice, oftentimes also driven by the closed shop clause. So once you enter in a new place, you are automatically a union member. And most of the people, they tend to be in best jobs, so in the public sector, in big firms, etc., etc. Though, that's the crisis of unionism that is very weird and unique and opposite to the European history. Right now, with the full employment in Quebec, unions are losing members. Because they say, I'm a technician, I have these skills, I no longer need a union, I go across the street, I find another company, they gave me $5 more per hour, so I can go alone, I can find my job, they pay me more, I don't need unions to protect me. Whereas, in a different context, like in the end of the 60s in Southern Europe, with the full employment, that was the moment where we had the highest unionization rate and the highest peak, due to a different institutional context as well, due to different individual values. Going to a little bit quickly to the first and last, so political action and populism, and comparing two different contexts that I know pretty well, like Quebec and Italy. So in Italy, the social democratic are now sparse, broken, squeezed. Unions, and especially one union, is becoming the new left wing. This union is trying to reframe all the political debate and to mobilize many others, big civil society organizations, to show that migrants are the resource for the country. And they are present in every single moment, they have a voice, and they really put ahead and push that we are against this populism. We are against to say that migrants are the issue. Whereas here in Quebec, we have the same attack of populism a few years ago, and now is resuscitating. So the new government is resuscitating this with the charter of the Quebec values. So you want to migrate here, you have to really comply with our values, and you cannot have this and that. Unions, they're not taking a clear position on this. So, because unions are fearful, since their membership are a subset of the society, so many people are in favor of this, even among the members, so they don't want to take a clear position. We asked to our unions of the professor, you come, what is your position about it? Do you want me to do not have a cross or a kippah or anything else? They say, no, we don't want to enter into this now. Then we have the collective agreement to establish a negotiation, so it's better to stay outside of this because if not, we lose members. That's the worst that a union can do. A union has to take a position on this. A union has to protect these workers that are generally at the lowest level of the food chain. This is, for me, a big mistake that unions are doing. It's okay.
Perhaps on the question, because as you mentioned Europe, and perhaps you can continue also on the question of migrant, that the ETUC took a very clear position. It was based to say, okay, about the value of the trade unions. We will not negotiate about that. But we had also a member attend to the meeting of the leadership, and they say, okay, but we have a nice position, but nobody is listening to our position. We cannot convince that the people, and that was really difficult. It is still difficult because the position is clear, but it's not working. So you can continue to repeat that, and you say, okay, but the European institutions are not listening to us. The members are not really listening to us. And what do? They didn't have an answer on that, but they just noticed that we have kind of clear message, but the message is not heard even by the members voting for the extreme right, but not only for that. And that's a huge difficulty when they don't have so far any solution, but at least they put on the table there is a problem between a discourse very clear, but not working in a way. We can continue to say that and be proud to say that, but there we have no influence on society with these discourses. So that's.
Thanks. I'm not going to take that up right now. I'm going to continue a little bit about organizing because you mentioned it as well, and you mentioned the yellow unions in Denmark. Everybody knows the concept of yellow unions.
I want to take this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Danish is a little bit different.
Yeah.
What does yellow mean?
Sorry?
What does yellow mean in Denmark?
Yellow means basically that these are unions that are not red. No, it means that unions are not the classic unions made by the worker movement with a socialist view. In Denmark, quite often they're Christian actually, and they don't believe that it really is a conflict between management and employees. So that's very much it. They also give the fee is much lower, so it means that a lot of people are becoming members of these unions to still have unemployment benefits and to have legal advice. And recently was made a survey why people became members of the yellow unions, and 88% answered it was because of the money. It's cheaper. And that does make a challenge. You mentioned again 10% of the unions in Denmark are actually yellow. They were only 2% in 1995. So the decrease of union density from 95 to 2015 was from 73% to 67%, but now 10% of the 67% are yellow unions. In itself, it might not constitute a problem because they don't have a policy. They don't at all contribute in any way to discussion about the welfare state. They are not as such a challenge. But the challenge, of course, is that politicians, especially liberal politicians, might think liberal in Europe is something else than in US, I know that, but right-wing politicians, they might think, hey, now there are fewer members of the unions, which means are they actually a legit partner in the partnership in coordinated market economy? So that's one of the issues here why organizing is quite important. And just to mention one example, about 15 years ago, we had a very right-wing finance minister, and he came out, or tax minister, and he came out with a suggestion that they should not, that the fee to the union should not be deductible anymore. 24 hours later, he came back and said, no, I'm going to withdraw this suggestion. The people who persuaded him to withdraw that question was the employers' organization. And why is that? If the employers' organization doesn't have an opponent, they cannot legitimize that they control so much of the labor market. So they need each other. You know, Batman needs the Joker. Yeah. Otherwise, Batman has nobody to fight with, right? That's how it is, you know. So they need each other to actually be active partners in these systems here. So the whole question about organizing right now in many countries, I think, is also about visibility. In our situation, we have had this problem that we have had no real industrial conflict in the private sector for more than 20 years. So it's not very visible why the unions are necessary. We have had a few conflicts in the public sector, and suddenly the public sector unions are doing quite well in terms of popularity in the public opinion and stuff like that. But there's a problem about visibility. I don't think the unions are very good at actually presenting what they do. I don't think the shop stewards are very good, and they do a hell lot of good work. It's not about that. But when you do the good work in a very cooperative atmosphere, you have a problem presenting it as this was a fight. And that's actually one of the problems we have in the Nordic countries, to be honest, right? I know you think it's a luxury problem. I'm very happy you brought up the yellow unions because I think it's a problem, but nobody else does, apparently. But we have this luxury problem that everything is going very well. We are very cooperative and so forth. That makes it very, very invisible to a 25-year-old why this person should be a member of a union, because this person was born into the system and didn't know anything about the fight. And we know it as well. Our first-year students at sociology have no idea what the Danish model is. When I talk about Thatcher, it's totally blank. Nobody heard anything about Thatcher whatsoever. They did 20 years ago, but not today, right? So the whole thing about telling about how the unions was rolled back, that's not a reality in their world. That's history. That's old, ancient history. And that narrative, I think, really is a problem. You don't tell this narrative, right? Because, and I think it's one of the ways that you have to make new narratives. And we have also situations, I actually have a couple of examples in Denmark where we had a really good narrative and a really bad narrative. And the really good one was recently about Ryanair. We had a problem about Ryanair wanted to fly in Copenhagen, but they wanted a collective agreement in all other countries than Copenhagen, obviously. So they said Ryanair, the planes are flying from Ireland, so that is actually Irish ground. And the labor court said, no, that's not how it is. Workers are living in Denmark, that's where the base are. So Danish collective agreements should apply. The LO was really good at presenting this as there was a dragon, and the dragon was O'Leary and Ryanair. There was a princess, or prince, that was the stewardesses and the pilots. And there was a knight in white armor, and that was LO. And they did very well. This narrative was done very well, but they also learned from a narrative that was the opposite some 5 years earlier, where LO was a dragon. So I think also your unions really are working very much right now about making good narratives about what happens. They also are on the forefront in many cases and know this might be an explosive case. We already now put in our communication department and work with these things, and I think it's highly necessary to present these things. Only problem is that Ryanair right now are flying 3 million passengers from Copenhagen Airport without having a base in Copenhagen. They fly in from the Baltic countries, 5 o'clock in the morning, pick up passengers, fly around in Europe, land in Copenhagen, 10 o'clock in the evening, fly back the plane in Baltic, and have Baltic collective agreements for all the stewardesses and so forth. So we have another problem here about internationalization. Maybe we can get back to that later, but I think that's also another problem that every union and every national industrial relations system has right now, that the employers can move around between countries and actually do regime shopping in a way we've never seen before. And that is really a problem because every system is, very local, very national. If you take the French system, it's very different from the Danish system, industrial relations-wise. Union density is 11% in France, right? It's 67% in Denmark, and so forth. So I think one of the big challenges as well to any union and to any labor market system right now is this internationalization where employers have really the upper hand. I got a little bit around here, sorry.
I think what is important here in the Scandinavian countries is that you have a kind of change the last, I would say, 5-10 years. The change first was LO in Sweden losing a lot of members, and they did a study, and they just noticed what you said, that young people don't go to the trade unions, and then they took before for granted that it's part of the gene. You go to the labor market and you are a member. You don't have to speak, and they decide to speak. But we have also what is happening now in Finland, that the government is attacking the trade unions and the partnership. So what's normally at European level, the Scandinavian don't want really to cooperate with the rest because they say, well, where is the problem? We have a good system, high level of unionization. It's not for us. It's perhaps very interesting for you because we have a problem in France, 10%, but we have 70. But now it's changing, and in the last executive of the ETUI, the Scandinavians were much more in favor to exchange about trade union renewal, to see what the others are doing, because they are in need. And that's really, if you look to Finland, it's kind of sea change in the system when the government decide to try to kill what is the partnership. And I would like to say an anecdote on Ryanair, because I think that's, so if something happened which was really positive in Europe, is the Ryanair and the Ryanair strike, mainly the cabin people, and that's really a kind of good story. And what is interesting, that ITF put a lot of money on the strike. For the first time, you have a strike. Normally when there is a strike, airline what you have in the newspaper, that people are blocked somewhere, the airline, the striker are so bad, etc. Here the story, the narrative in the newspaper was completely different. They say, why Ryanair is not paying the people because they have a right to be paid if there is a delay in the flight, and they were supporting the flight. But if you look to the communication of ETF and ATF, they have nothing. On the website in August, they were the most boring communique technically, and I asked the guy, because we had a meeting, I asked the guy, you spend 1 million and they had 10 people working on Ryanair. Why you don't communicate? He said, oh yes, Philippe, it's good, very good question. We should have done that. So you have the kind of massive campaign on Ryanair, the stuff we are winning something, and there is no communication at all. No one tweet from there. Okay, it was the summer, difficult to have the revolution during the summer, 7th of August, the strike. But it was a disaster in communication. The first time we have so good news, that because it's very tricky what they are doing, and no communication. So you want to say?
Yeah, that's one thing about Ryanair. I think also it's a really, really strong story because it's also transnational cooperation between cabin crew and pilots across borders, right? And the whole thing started, Ryanair started the whole thing in itself, right? They made a mistake last year about the holiday, how many holidays they actually could have, right? But I think the really strong story about that is that you actually can see something of cooperation across borders among the workers, and that's normally one of the biggest problems about multinational companies.
Yeah. Okay. John?
Well, I guess I'll sort of pick up on some of the problems, but I think maybe one of the good thing and talk about allies and repertoires. I think in terms of union revitalization, I think both across North America and Western Europe, you have seen all kinds of really positive developments over the past few decades. You've seen new kinds of living wage and minimum wage or basic income types of campaigns where people are talking and have won, real gains for people, usually at a city level or a state level or at a region level. And I think those have really sort of taken off, and they've really certainly had a good deal of influence, first in the United States, but now have also been the inspiration for here in Canada and Ontario and other provinces as well. At the same time, you've seen more unions being involved in things about housing in their own cities with the Fairbnb campaign, trying to take on Airbnb and say, this is something that we need, affordable housing, and we can't have this commoditization of all our housing so that it just becomes a sort of a rental for those who are tourists or outside. It makes our communities completely unaffordable, right? And then, of course, it makes our lives utterly insecure. And I think unions have really, in terms of Airbnb, have really made a good deal of difference. The anti-Uber campaign that's been going on, I think, is something that's also really positive, and that you're seeing sort of a global uptake on that. The fact that we had an Occupy Wall Street movement, of which there was both some union involvement, but also the fact that you had this global movement and demonstration that went on for months across the world saying there is something fundamentally wrong with our system, and it involved young people, older people, working people, unions, all there protesting, say something is wrong in terms of income inequality. It has to do with big business. It has to do with our governments. And I think those are all really positive things that we should keep in mind. But the sad socialist pessimist in me, right, says these are all great, okay? But what happens when you introduce a new minimum wage? Well, what happens, of course, is that you hire more people through temporary agencies. You hire more people as self-employed. You hire more people under the table. And you say, look, you can have this job or you don't have this job, right? You don't have to pay taxes if we pay under the table, okay? Those people are suddenly not there. What happens when you begin to win better housing? Well, suddenly you take away access to unemployment insurance, or you've got your Ghent system, as they are seemingly in Belgium and in Finland and in Sweden, and suddenly there's no interest then in joining a union, right? So even though you might win a gain on one hand, suddenly it's ripped away on the other. So there's the sense that, we're trying to run faster, but in running faster, we're not keeping up, that global capital and neoliberalism is always 2 or 3 steps ahead, and I think that's kind of a problem. So if there are going to be new repertoires that begin to challenge this and begin to take this on, I think, as Philip mentioned, it's a big challenge, but we have to take on global climate change and the fact of pollution, right? That has to be something that unions have to take up, because it's not just about the future of whether you have a good wage or not. It's about the future of whether you have any work or not. And that the fact that you're going to have any good work if you don't deal with having a more sustainable economy. And that means having zero warming and zero waste as part of your collective agreements. And that might mean massive types of job transition, but unions, I think, have to be able to begin to develop those kinds of coalitions and those kinds of issues, bring in those issues forward to both their members, but also begin to discuss with environmental activists and with green parties that are going to push that kind of agenda. Another big thing, I think, and it looks like the AFL-CIO is doing a bit of this, where are those who are non-union? Where are those who are at risk of low-wage work? Where are those people who are immigrants and people of color in our union organizations and in our central organizations? The AFL is beginning, I understand, to have some representatives of people of color and those who are non-union. I think that should be a global phenomenon. I think every labor organization and every labor federation should have seats for people of color, people who are exploited, people who are in low-wage work and who aren't covered, whether that's through worker centers, whether that's through immigrant centers, whether that's through any kind of activist organization dealing with issues of inequality in their community. You put those organizations and say, look, you're part of us. We need to help you. How can we do that? That begins to change the dynamic very significantly. Lastly, I think one of the great things you read when you read about European labor history is how the Swedish unions and the Scandinavian unions generally, as well as Belgium, all won control of more or less of unemployment insurance and had some control over their pension funds. You want to build coalitions, you want to build solidarity, say these are policies that we as working people provide for you. Why have your densities been so high for so many years? People have to join a union to get unemployment insurance. They can suddenly see, Jesus, we don't have to go to a government cap in hand to say, oh, sorry, you didn't work 52 weeks last year and you weren't really formally employed, so you're not going to see a damn dime when you're unemployed now suddenly. You go to a union, you go to look at people how are covered in terms of their training, in terms of their unemployment, people are covered. They can see a real benefit of that. But that then leads to this thing about pensions, where I think unions are getting fucked, and we are not using that because the size of pension funds these days is massive. But we have given up all the control to big finance, right, and to big banks and investment banks. That money is people's money. That money should be used for people's purposes. That money should be used for transition. You tell people that we have this money, we have all the wealth we need. We don't need more wealth. We need to share the wealth we have to make a better future. And I think if we make those repertoires of contention about making control of those policies, then that's a whole different kind of ballgame politically.
Okay. Jan?
I want to join John's political party.
Yeah, you are the second member. I already pay my fee to it.
In the neoliberal era, it has been capital and finance capital in particular that's been setting the agenda. We have been fighting these defensive battles one after another. We have been reacting rather than taking the initiative. That's been the story for most of our adult lives, really. It's worth asking the question: what happens when those folks get their way? I mean, if you look at the red states in the United States, they have got their way. There is no collective bargaining for teachers and other public sector workers in West Virginia or in Oklahoma or in these other states, right? There is no automatic dues deduction for unions such as they are, which are very, very low density even by American standards. And yet it's there, not in Michigan where I am, but in West Virginia, that you've got this massive upsurge where every single public school in the state was closed for over 2 weeks by the teachers. And it wasn't a strike led by the union, although the union did get behind it. The union hurried up to get, as I think it was Martin Luther King said, sometimes you have to hurry up to get in front of the people, right? It was a upsurge from below. by teachers who basically, unlike the collective bargaining regime that exists in Michigan, where we bargain with local school boards and the teachers' unions tend to be focused, if they're focused on politics at all, they focus on who gets elected to the local school board. Here in West Virginia, there's no mediating institutions. It's the state sets their salary. And so they mobilized against the state, and they went to the state capitol. And they put pressure. It wasn't just about wages. It was about health care. It was about dignity, because they were being told that their new health care plan would force them to wear Fitbits on their wrists to determine what their level of exercise activity was. And if it was below a certain threshold, they would be charged extra on their health care plans. So it was like totally invading their personal space and what kind of lives they're living, what kind of exercise they're getting. There was a proposal to roll back, let's see, what else were some of the other issues? Eliminate seniority, eliminate automatic deduction of dues, I mentioned that. And so all of these things they defeated. All of the initiatives which were the kind of next generation of basically ALEC / Koch brothers / you name it, the agenda to totally disorganize workers from a union point of view were defeated by this upsurge. The union, and it was led by rank and file activists who used the social media to get it going. Then the union came in and helped to coordinate it, but the rank and file there continued to be a bit of push and pull between those two, because the union, once they made major gains, they got a 5% increase for the teachers, wanted to call it a day and say the strike, we should go back to work. And the activists who got it started said, we're not going until we get raises for other public sector workers in this state. So it reminded me of Solidarność, actually, if you remember back to 1981 and how that got going in the Gdansk shipyards. They had some local thing, but they broadened it out. Their demands applied to other workers, and that generated solidarity on the part of other workers like the transit workers and others in Gdansk, and then eventually it spread beyond that city. This time, too, the teachers from the very beginning said, well, we're not only are we making certain demands on behalf of all public sector workers, but we're going to insist, that you make these increases. What we get will go to the bus drivers, who were a separate entity. They weren't in the union. They were probably not even in a union at all, given that state. And to the workers who work in the cafeteria, who provide and clean the buildings that we're in. They stood for all of them. And those workers, in turn, stood for them. So there was no possibility of keeping any of those schools open because the bus drivers wouldn't take the kids to the schools. And so, there's a real lesson there. That was the most deregulated labor market in the United States, looks like that. And that's what could happen in that situation. It actually made politicization and targeting the real enemy, at least the proximate agent of the enemy, not local school board, the state government, which was totally Republican dominated, easier and more transparent, and action, The impact of that is kind of like Gdansk, there was a multiplier effect, a demonstration effect rather of that. The same thing happened with the lunch counter sit-ins that led to the formation of SNCC in 1960-61. Same thing with the Flint sit-down strike. You win a victory like that and it starts to spread. So it spread quickly to 3 other states. And there are other states, like Washington State, where there is a much more institutionalized collective bargaining regime, but they're also striking for the first time in many years. So it's had a demonstration effect even outside of the zone where there is very little intermediation of labor relations. So I always want to provide a counterpoint to John's pessimism, because the values are but I never see the energy of how the hell are we going to win this thing? How are we going to actually push back and succeed on this front? We've got part of us our fucking morale, honestly. Part of the problem in Michigan is that the labor movement did not support Bernie, even though Bernie's policy positions were far more aligned with them than Hillary, and he had a theory of power that required mass mobilization. His standard line was, you can elect me, that's not going to do much. You have the people who mobilized to win the Democratic primary, if he had one, and he won in Michigan, by the way, you have to keep going after I'm elected, because only mass mobilization and organization is going to be able to change the things in Washington that I'm articulating and that you want. The Democratic Party on the other side, including Obama, had no theory of power like that. The labor movement had no role in their theory of power, honestly. They believe the labor movement is a dead thing. And, you know, I don't want us to be reinforcing that with our pessimism, right? They see it as a spent force, right? For them, the future of the power of the Democratic Party lay in demographics, lay in the fact that we are going to become a country, a majority people of color country, that people of color overwhelmingly identify with Democratic Party right now. And this kind of a theory, it did not rely on organizing working class, let alone unions, as the principal vehicle for doing that. And so when Obama had a choice, he had a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and of course he'd just been elected with a massive majority. Did he pass labor law reform that was, you know, that the labor was pushing? No, he didn't see that as particularly important. He went for health care. So, you know, if he'd done it in the opposite direction, we would have more of a Canadian set of labor law reforms. And that, of course, is no panacea, as everybody from Canada in this room knows, but it certainly would have been helpful and strengthened the labor movement and would have reflected an idea that, yes, it's a key component of rebuilding the power of the Democratic Party and taking it in a direction other than the neoliberal one. That really didn't inform Obama's decision-making process or all the people that were around him, which is not just the corporate wing. It's a lot of people of color within the organization, too, that haven't been part of the labor movement, haven't seen the labor movement fight for them. Here's 5 white guys, right, from the labor movement of our respective countries. All too often, that's the face of organized labor, right? So, you know, they didn't buy into that either. So the part of the work that needs to happen is what you said, John, about building a labor movement whose leadership reflects the actual membership we have now and the demographics of the country as a whole. And I could go on, but I think I didn't keep track of time, and I have a feeling I've talked
okay.
a long time, so let me stop there.
Raoul is still smiling, so that's okay for me. So now we have around 20 minutes for question, debate, and so who is the first? Yes. You need a mic, sorry.
It's just for the recording. And you should know that.
Hi, my name is Fred Wilson. I'm from Unifor, and here my badge says the North American Solidarity Project, which anybody's interested in that, we can talk about it later. But I'd like to push the panelists to draw some conclusions from what I've heard you talk about, because it's not a very cheerful, you know, kind of summary if you were to pull it all together. And there are sparks, and there are some, you know, sparks of life. There are some new things in the repertoire, I guess we could say. But overall, you have what we call in Unifor and at the North American Solidarity Project, you've laid out all of the elements of a broken model that the mainstream labor movement in Canada and the United States and in Europe is sleepwalking with this broken model. And it seems to me that broken model is up there on the chart up there, where we've contracted out our politics to political parties that are in decline and that do not and have not made worker interests central to their politics. And we've contracted out our politics to them. And so when their political fortunes decline, what fills the void is right-wing populism, which is now competing for our members. And our members' reference point when it comes to politics is not their union. It has in the past been that declining political force. So I could go on about this and all the different examples of this, but who, my question I would put to you is, so who is saying that the model is broken, and that unless the labor movement understands this, you know, because to some extent our leadership or the mainstream labor movement has been, to some extent they have left the model and are complicit with the right-wing politics, with the right-wing populism. There are unions that have actually gone there. And then there are other unions and labor movements that are just stuck in their post-war consensus political modes, thinking all we have to do is wait for the Social Democrats to come back, which is a folly. So who is saying the model is broken, we need a new type of, what we call a new type of solidarity, much less transactional, much more along the lines of what John was talking about, much more independent, where I put when our members are hear right-wing populists and they go to that, up to 40% of trade union members in Ontario just voted for a right-wing populist. It's like there's a cry, it's like a cry of despair, who speaks for us? And they're, so who are going to be their champions, and when are we going to figure out how we make our own politics and unions themselves become the champions of the working class again? Anyways, so my question is, draw this together and can we, is there some way that the labor movement, the question can be put to them? What we're doing now doesn't work. We need to do something entirely different.
Okay, we take several questions because so you can answer to. Yeah, sure.
Je vais poser ma question en français.
There is no translation.
Quand on regarde la situation en Europe sur le long terme, ce qui est assez frappant, c'est le fait qu'il y a eu un changement total de relation entre les partis et les syndicats à l'intérieur du mouvement ouvrier. Mais cette rupture, à ma connaissance en tout cas, n'a à peu près pas été thématisée de façon fondamentale, ni à l'intérieur des partis, ni à l'intérieur des syndicats. Ils se sont séparés les uns des autres, mais c'est un espèce de divorce mutuel, à consentement mutuel, on n'est pas très sûr, mais en tout cas silencieux. Et la question que je pose, c'est de savoir si finalement cette espèce de silence extrêmement long sur cette rupture, est-ce que ce n'est pas aussi l'une des raisons pour lesquelles c'est aujourd'hui extrêmement difficile, aussi bien pour les partis que pour les syndicats, de retrouver le type de relation qu'ils peuvent entretenir avec une base ou des bases qui devraient théoriquement être les mêmes et qui deviennent de moins en moins les mêmes. Donc ma question, elle est sur est-ce que dans les pays que vous observez, vous avez connaissance de thématisation forte de cette rupture qu'on observe, je crois, quand même à peu près partout.
Okay, that's who is doing the translation.
I hope I have this right. Christian Dufour, as Christian looks at the long-term situation in Europe, he sees a profound change, which is a complete reversal of relationships between unions and political parties. It's a divorce. And yet, what is so preoccupying in his mind is that there's a complete silence within each of these parties in trying to make sense and thematize the consequences and the nature of this divorce. And he wonders if, and here I hope I have the question right, Christian, is it this very silence and lack of trying to grapple with this which makes it so difficult to rekindle a relationship with workers and with the basis of each of both the social democratic parties and the unions, which at the same time is changing?
Okay, another question, yes.
Just a quick couple of questions. Just on a European Union, I think it's important because there is it really depends, as certain people understand, it depends who unions dance with, who unions work with. And I understand that there is a crisis and decline in trade unionism, but there is an incredible fragmentation of the state. And in the European Union, what Capital has done is played on that national fragmentation, not just in terms of inward investment or anything like that, but we saw it in Pete Turnbull's explanation that in Germany there is this private company for a bus company that it looks like it's in Britain, right? So that and in North America, the fact that you can have collective bargaining in some contexts in the public sector, not in others, that presents a real coordinating headache. So the role of the political is important. But I just want to echo what John Peters has has argued that principles are key. Unions in Britain, for example, have suddenly become very scared after a long history of kind of anti-racism of talking about immigration, right? We're not going to talk about it. There's going to be a silence. We know many trade union officials that are written to by members. Why is my money being used on black worker sections? Why are you doing this? You know, why are you spending money on equality projects and so forth? But the answer is very straightforward. It's your policy. That's the policy that was elected in your conference, right? That's your strategy. Black worker sections, LGTB sections, whatever, right? Or equality or inclusion or welfare is the policy of the union. And I think what unions need to do is define these policies clearly. And there is a risk that someone might leave, right? But we were astounded by the amount of letters maybe coming into offices. But the point is that unions haven't defined themselves that clearly. And I think that kind of socio-political identity, yes, they mobilize. But look at the living wage campaign. The Tories in Britain pulled a fast one. We'll call a new heightened version of the minimum wage the living wage, right? Why? Because the living wage wasn't tied into regulation. It was a kind of notional thing that was developed and almost like a private sector equivalent. So I think the importance is that political agendas have to be even more explicit, right? And somehow, in some countries in Britain, and you know, Corbyn, and okay, with Brexit, Corbyn is messing things up a little bit, but Corbyn was put there in part by the trade union movement, right? And over the last 20 years, the trade union movement has been radicalizing in the RMNT, in the CWU, in Unite, in Unison, or maybe less than Unison now, PCS, and they have been key, alongside one or two factions of social democracy, in rethinking the leadership of Labour Party. So there is a possibility of building on principles and building on networks. There are some cases that buck the trend. The only thing is, I think unions have to be more explicit about their so-called socio-political identity. And there will be a risk to that, because I think the Danish colleague has very clearly understood there is going to be a risk in it because of the vulnerabilities of the workforce. But I think that point's important.
Just a very quick point on what we'll call torque, and several of you brought this up. It's a question of why is it that you have public sector conflicts and suddenly unions are more popular, more visible, more instrumental, a whole lot of things. And people have always talked about, you know, narrative resources and the importance of victories on which you can mobilize. I'm going to use a different example. We've been trying to figure out some of the movements in legislation and legislative provisions in Canada. And it's very clear that the movement from card check to mandatory ballots is entirely linked to partisan politics and the movement back and forth, with the major exception of Quebec, where you don't have that kind of movement for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into now. We're going to talk about tomorrow. But an interesting one is the anti-strike breaker, because the only place other than Quebec where it's stuck is BC. And I've been asking people in BC, why is this the case? British Columbia, for those who are not from Canada. And they said, well, because nominally it should have gone the same way as the movement from card check to mandatory ballots. And it said, oh, the governments were afraid of violence. In other words, there was a real risk, and we're not making a Sorelian argument for violence, but it's the fact that there was a sense that it could cause public perturbations if there was a change in this respect. So you do need some torque.
Okay, there is other question. You want to also? Yeah, but okay. If it's okay that we take all the questions and then I reduce the time to answer.
Oh,
to
okay,
1
sorry.
minute each.
Yeah.
From 2. But I think that's we need to have all the questions from the audience.
Okay, I try to
See
be
what we
brief
can
and
do.
try in English so that maybe it can go quicker. Okay, I'd just like to ask you if you observe in each of your countries democratic innovation inside the unions in the attempt to build new policy orientation regarding all those new topics or less traditional topics that need framing from the unions. And maybe it's less obvious than before regarding traditional themes like redistributions and so on. And yeah, are unions experimenting like new instruments to build congruence with the basis membership and so on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting dialogues you've had here. My name is Maria Steinberg and I'm from Sweden. I am an associate professor of the University of Örebro, and my interest is mainly in work environment law, mental health and safety representatives. I'm thinking many things, because in Sweden we have a very high, many people belong to the trade union, about 80%. Men and women work almost as much. But what I can see, the trend is that there are less people in the blue-collar workers, and the white-collar workers are gaining more and more. But if you ask the young people what they are interested in, they are not only interested in the money, how much money you earn, at least in Sweden. They are also interested in the work environment. So I, of course, since this is my field, think, couldn't there be a future also for the trade union, not only about salaries, but also of other things, which has been. But for example, in Sweden, they are interested in. The young people work a lot of overtime, and they have children, and when they look for jobs, they also look for, do they have a good family planning scheme? So when I have children, what will happen to me, and things like that. So I would raise the question a little bit about the trade union being interested in other things than the tradition, not, other things maybe today. So I would just be interested to hear your voice in that. Thank you.
Okay. Is there other question? Okay, we start with Jan, if it's okay. It's very short, because Raoul has to summarize all the discussion.
Well, going back to Fred, I do feel like your description, Fred, is pretty accurate. We are kind of, as a labor movement in Michigan, not grasping the enormity of what's going on, and that's reflected in the fact that we didn't take on Bernie and run with him. Our expectations were framed within the existing model, and within that model they were rightly low, and from that vantage point it was too ambitious to support Bernie. So we're trapped in a kind of spiral of low expectations, low hope. We need to, and I'm not sure that the labor leadership is the ones to look for to break out of that trap. Frankly, I think like what we saw in West Virginia, that was not the labor leadership. What we're seeing with these ballot initiatives that I described earlier, that was not labor leadership. It wasn't even labor rank and file. The other thing is, I think that the unions need to, we can blame the parties, but in Michigan, the Democratic Party is not a neoliberal party. It's not a party of the, it remains a party aligned with labor. And I don't want to put too much of the blame on the party. Labor unions ourselves, the labor movement, has not done this education about history. We haven't tried to change our members' politics, especially the more conservative unions. Like there are building trades unions that probably split 50-50 for Trump versus Hillary in this last election. A lot of their leaders don't want to take on the 50% of their members that are already in a place where they're willing to vote for Trump. So let's not put it all on the party. The labor movement has to take responsibility for its education and its work on challenging the cultural norms of neoliberalism. And we haven't really done a very good job of that. I don't know if we even know how to do that.
Well, those are all big questions, and I think that's what we should be asking. Asking the big questions, right? Whether you're in your local union, whether you're at the Confederation, whether you're in a Solidarity, whether you're at a convention, a labor convention, I think we have to start asking these questions. Gregor, in his brilliance, and as well as the whole other team, well, this is what we've done. We've brought a bunch of people together to say, well, what kind of experimentation is going on? And I'm hoping that this is a way of raising these kinds of questions. Okay, so we're experimenting, but what do we got to do? We got to begin. We're 12 years away, according to the IPCC, from having our world completely thrown apart. I think the time for people to say, what are the questions? Is our model working? If it's not, then how do we solve it? How can we begin today to meet the challenges that we're facing over the next decade? And I think that's a good place to start. And we can start in our unions, we can start in our colleges. We can then take that and start talking about this in our political parties where we have access. If it's the NDP, if it's the Social Dems, if it's the Socialists, these questions have to start to be asked and say, on the agenda before us is a global climate crisis. On the agenda before us is a global inequality crisis. How do we solve those? And how do we get there how do we get there today? Not in 100 years, how do we get there today?
Yeah. Thanks for the questions. I'm not quite sure the model is broken. I'll get a little bit back to what I said before. I think many of the questions are actually is about how you present the problems and how you, by presenting the problems, also have an idea how they're going to be solved. And by that I mean everybody of us is living through a narrative. And politics is a narrative. You describe a reality in different ways. And I think the right-wing parties, some of the right-wing parties have been really, really skilled at telling what globalization is about for the working class, right? And that narrative has to be told in another way. And socialism or reference to Marx or anything like that probably is not the solution to a lot of people. It's more about what does globalization do to me? What does immigration do to me? Right now, right here. That's what's taking place when two candidates is debating something before a political election. So if Trump did anything good in the whole world, he actually told us that narrative is very important because he had a very simple narrative. That narrative actually collected 59 million votes, right? So why can't the other part do it as well? Why is it the right-wing parties being so good at that? So yeah, back to the narrative I think is very important. And thank you for the British Columbia thing. I was in doubt what BC was about. In our house it's before child. So where we get a glass of red wine and stuff like that.
Okay, just to advertise my research, but as well as to finish with a more positive diagram and trend, you can see this is a study we did where the dot line is the union density across time in most of European countries, and we put a 0 reference point, 1980. And the solid line is the social confidence in unions. So it's not only flat, but even goes up during the crisis of 2009. Here, yes, it's a broken model for me, unionism, because you have a big gap to fill that is becoming more and more and more evident. And this gap is given especially who are the most confident people are women, are migrants, are people who are precarious, are people who feel the crisis. Unions have to be able to have a narrative to frame this unfairness. People are still looking at unions. When I interviewed here in Quebec, to shift back to Quebec, all the 35 people or the 5 union executives say, oh, people, they call us at the phone, they ask for 10,000 staff. Oh, do we have to do this? Do we have to do this? Say, yes, this is confidence in unions. People are searching for you. And you cannot say, no, you are not my member. I cannot, you give an answer, okay, you have to go somewhere else. Because this is a way to union to close up in themselves. And is this a matter of union giving more voice within the union, as has been asked? Yes, it can be, but for me, we have to give much more voice to people outside the unions. Unions have to really look outside themselves. There is much more resources to gain rather than look inside, give more voice to people who are voting Ford or Lego and having troubles during a union meeting. And union must be fill this gap, framing their narrative at different scale, at a local scale, a regional scale, a national scale, about unfairness, what is fair for us, and what is fair for the society, especially. About the legislation, I mean, yes, legislation is able to frame a lot employment relation dynamics, but as I always show in my, I have one class in my course about collective bargaining, about legislation. The legislation follows most of the time the union movement historically. It's not the other way around. So union must be able to create a larger movement and then push for some legislation change. We still have 5 minutes, so maybe another question.
Yeah, that's the after my 2 minutes too. No, I think before closing that, starting with that, I think the real problem is that people are going down, and mainly young people, and they trust, but they are not member of association. They are not member of the church. They are not member of political parties. So young generation are not member of an association. They have to pay, and they have no voice. They want to have voice. So I think the structure of the trade union are not appropriate, but any other structure are not better appropriate, and that we have to think. And I will go to the Belgian model, because everyone, including me, saw that it was because we had the unemployment benefit and the trade unions were involved in that we have such high membership. It's not true. The true is when you pay your due to the trade union, most probably you will have the money back, because there is sectoral agreement. So you are a member of trade unions for free. You don't have to pay. At Christmas, you receive 80% of what you paid back. First time I received, I said, strange, I pay, and why back? And I suggest to the leader we should stop that, and because then the member pay nothing, so they are not really involved, because they can have all the service for free. I say I fully agree from my trade union, the main trade union. But if we do that, we have some studies, we will lose 30 to 40% of the members. So something interesting in that story is that you have for free, you would have a lot of members, because there is no obligation, perhaps. First remark. Second remark, I think that's the question we have to change. Okay, it's nice to change, but we have members, and members, you have to explain, and that will be the debate perhaps in the afternoon, to IG Metall, that they have to change. It's working well. They have members growing. Why they have to change? And Verdi, they try to change. Why? Because they are losing members. And there was an idea from Anke Hassel, the director of the WSC, the research center of the trade union, say, okay, why we don't have kind of solidarity between trade unions? So IG Metall is taking care about what are the fight in Amazon or Ryanair. It's not the same sector, but you support the fight. And then you can perhaps mix that the strong sector, they will not move to a kind of very different trade unionists very quickly. It will be slow, and that we know from political science. It will take years, if not decades. But if they can show, because they have still money, some solidarity to other sector, and to organize, because without money you can do nothing, and support then, or having a kind of joint narrative, I think you can balance what is the traditional role of the trade unions, and you will not move them so quickly out, and the new experiment. And lastly, I think that for me, if you put what John you were arguing in the European context, I think the new alliance should be between the Green and the trade union. Why? Because the Green have the narrative for the future. You like it or not, you don't like it, but that's about climate change. And we have the members. They need collective actors, because they have the narrative, but without collective actors, you go nowhere. And we have the collective actors, but without narrative, we go nowhere. So this kind of new discussion around the future, I think should at least be envisaged by trade unions. But it's a long story. So.
Just before Raoul speaks, I don't need the micro. It's just that on behalf of all the conference, I want to thank him for organizing this series of sessions. It all comes from Raoul, for those who weren't here at the beginning. So thank you.
Thank you.
And he's doing that because we have another session, so we
that's
move
right. So
in the afternoon.
So the thought of this pair of sessions was to have sort of a discussion among academics or academics of various parcours, and then to have the practitioners table in the afternoon. And my role sort of is to try to maybe take some of these ideas and questions, because there certainly are a lot of questions. There are a couple of answers, but a lot of questions, and hopefully infuse the table this afternoon, to which you're obviously all welcome to come as well and exchange with the practitioners. So it's a tough job, because there's a lot, obviously. Now, if I return a little bit to the organization that was suggested with the different questions, so generally on political action, was definitely various things we heard here. The Batman and the Joker. I'm not sure. I have a feeling that there's a lot of Batmans out there that are quite content to be doing their thing without any potential Joker, or the other way around, depending on who is good and who's bad, of course. So, but it's a nice image, and it's actually it sort of asks the question. What's next after neoliberalism, right? What's the next narrative that could be the Joker's narrative or the Batman's narrative, whatever, whoever is your superhero and your villain, and so there was one. I think what was going through all of this was there needs to be a clear theme or message, or there need to be principles outlined, and that is sort of one big. Job and construction site in the labor movement itself in order to come back to political action. Then there was a discussion around the political parties, which of course I found fascinating, and part of it, from my point of view, anyways, is that the electoral strategies of political parties, there haven't been a lot of successful ones in the last little while. I would dare to say I don't see a lot of countries, maybe Denmark being. Well, I mean, in Denmark, the Social Democrats aren't in power, so maybe there aren't a lot of successful electoral strategies from the labor union side. And so one of the interesting questions that came up here, and I would love to discuss with the practitioners, of course, is, well, what is the relationship? You know, is it this silent divorce? Do we need to start throwing some hopefully not cutlery, but some plates at each other, so do we need to discuss this between Social Democrats and trade unions only? Are the Green parties involved, and in which way? What red-green projects are there? So BC is an interesting example right now because there's a red-green coalition government of sorts, and maybe there's something coming out of that. Electoral reform might come out of it, which would already be an interesting start, right? If there is electoral reform, in Canada at least, it would probably provide for much better and more progressive coalition building, and trade unions could have a very active role in that, right? In terms of new actors, and I found that very instructive as well. So it obviously depends a lot on the institutional framework, what type of actors can pop up. But certainly the type of ballot initiatives, the type of grassroots organizing, challenging state governments directly. I mean, all of these, there's a lot of different actors that could be aligned with, and unions sometimes do, sometimes don't. The disruption caused by the digital economy, Uber drivers, taxi drivers, I think there's a lot of opportunities here. And then maybe in terms of the creativity and the new methods and the repertoire, it all seemed to be brought back by various people to the question of message and framing. So it's really important to be smart about, once we have our principles, once we have our strategy, then to be smart about how to put all of that into a message that people will hear and people will perceive as a visible symbol of what the trade union political action and the political parties' proposals, how they go either hand in hand or how they should be opposed. The discussion about right-wing populism as is it a lesson to be learned? Do they do that particularly well? Well, I mean, they have less actors involved. They have less voices, right? I mean, it's often a very singular person or movement. It's often person-centered, whereas we are people-centered. So that seems to be another challenge to us, that either we don't have the personnel or we don't base our political action on just single people necessarily. But certainly the right wing has a very easy way to message these simple answers, false simple answers, because they center usually on individual persons. One of the interesting items, obviously, to keep in mind is that when right-wing populist governments or parties propose things that are more progressive than what Social Democrats are proposing, then we have obviously a problem. So, I mean, the minimum wage in Poland, I didn't know that, but that's fascinating. So this is sort of what I took away. I will try to distill that even more over a cup of coffee, and then hopefully we have a nice exchange this afternoon with the practitioners. Please do be present and come and discuss with them. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much. So